Expensive, the wind is expensive. I've been reading all the war. And I've been shutting down the stars. Yeah, the wind, rain, and the force.
And welcome to Put That Coffee Down, the freight sales show for closers. My name is Kevin Hill, and I am your host. As always, we're here in Global Supply Chain Week, so it's always exciting. We have very special guests to talk about global supply chains, as well as Jack Echeverria. He is Senior Manager of Global Logistics at Wayfair, and he'll be on in just momentarily to talk about what we're seeing in the global logistics market, maritime market, domestic market, and also through the retail supply chain. So it'll be a very interesting topic, and we'll talk about how logistics companies, how steamships, how everyone on the LSP side of the equation are kind of approaching deals right now. But first, let's start off with this. Something I read in Inc. magazine, stuck on a tough problem. Harvard research shows changing just one word can help you find a solution, a modest but meaningful improvement with zero effort. There's not a lot of things in life where just changing one word will dramatically affect your outcomes, but Harvard research found something. So what is it? It's by whenever you get stuck on a problem, instead of asking, what should I do? Change that one word to what could I do? Should is a very narrowing word. It limits the options and possibilities, and it keeps us stuck in our little box, if you will. By changing that word to could, it kind of expands your options and your thinking, right? What could I do? I could think of 100 things I could do. Which one will work? Well, I don't know until I start trying different things. So whenever you're asking, what should I do? It kind of, to me, it says, well, I only have one option, and that's what I should do. What could I do? I could do anything. So by changing that one word from should to could, Harvard research shows that you can really expand. So if you're talking about prospects, how should I reach out to this prospect? You're trying to find the best option, and you don't know the best option until you start experimenting a little bit. So if you say, how can I or how could I reach out to this prospect? What does that mean? How could I? I could email them. I could call them. I could show up at their front door. You could do a lot of different things. You could message them on LinkedIn, Twitter. You could start engaging in their posts. What could I do to win this business? You start really thinking and expanding your options. One of those options will usually work, but you never know which option it is, or which path or which method until you actually start doing it. So start whenever you come up against an issue or a problem, instead of saying, what should I do to resolve this? What can I do or what could I do to resolve this? I think you'll find the results to be powerful. Be powerful. You'll up your sales game, your business game, your life game. Doesn't really matter. It all flows in to one philosophy. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit about global supply chains and the logistics market and what shippers are seeing. And I'm going to do that now with Jack from Wayfair. We're going to bring him on the show right here and welcome him on. Jack, always good to see you. How are you doing today?
Good. I think you just saved my marriage with that. So, I think after this, I'm going to start rephrasing how I speak at home.
It's very powerful for that. What should I do or what can I do? Right? It's especially in logistics where you never know what the problem to any solution is until you start doing it. It's kind of like marriages too.
Exactly. No, I think it's always about your state of mind. And when I came into the industry, even if you can't do it today, I can't do it now, but I could do it in the future. How can I, obviously provide the best service, even if it's not conducive to the conditions now? How can I give, people value? So no, I agree 100% with the research. And if it's coming out of an Ivy League school, how can you argue?
I know, right? Yeah, how should I put together my supply chain, right? Exactly. How should I? I'm trying to look for the perfect solution, but there are no perfect solutions. Perfection is the enemy of profitability. How can I? You start kind of assembling different pieces, and all of a sudden you find something that works. and you go with that, and you leave behind the things that don't work, and all of a sudden you're iterating into something that works. And it works because we're going to talk about supply chains as competitive advantages today. And, through that process, you find something that maybe is a competitive advantage. If it isn't, then you keep on working on it, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I think that's kind of the mantra we've had at Wayfair and the Cascade logistics side that I'm on is we saw the value as a company in 2015 investing into our own supply chain and really controlling our own destiny, where it continued to escalate, where we started doing the landside services, we did the ocean services. So like you said, how can I be more value to our suppliers, and how can I be a better vendor to our, or a better partner to our vendors? So, that's kind of the mantra we have at Cascade Forwarding, which is a part of the Wayfair team, and it's always about the customer experience.
Yeah, and that brings me back to the should and could again, too. If you started out with how should we develop our supply chain, you kind of go back and copy other retailers, other companies in the space. How can we? It opens up the possibility of really creating your own logistics arm, taking control of that, and operating it in some respects like an LSP, right?
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's kind of what we saw the value in, is how can we become more entrenched with our suppliers? What are they looking for? How can we make their lives easier? How can we get the product to North America or Europe faster so their consumers could have access to it immediately? So that's where we saw a lot of the benefit, is just the visibility that our suppliers are wanting, knowing what's going on with their shipment, if there's delays, if there's any customs issue. And it's the more you control, the more access and the good partners you have. I mean, that's kind of where the supply chain is a competitive advantage. So that's what we really listen to our suppliers. We listen to the ocean carriers, the landside procurement teams, and just kind of saying, not just on the supplier side, but how can we be a better partner for the partners that we have. I mean, it's very cliche, but a lot of people hear, but they don't listen. And that's what we try to do at Wayfair and Castlegate.
Yeah, you're exactly right. A lot of people do hear, but they don't listen. And by taking control of the supply chain, by doing it in this novel way, it's a key differentiator, right? And it is a competitive advantage because you have capabilities that your competitors don't have, and you can get goods from Asia, from internationally, into your warehouses, sold, shipped, delivered at a much faster and efficient rate than company X and company Y, company Z.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and that's kind of what it is. I mean, for the segment that we're in, I mean, the consumers, I mean, nowadays with the internet, and people have so many options, and it's really going to come down to a low price point, good service, and just having access to the goods. And I think that's what we learned from the pandemic, is through the last 2 to 3 years, you really need to control your own destiny. You got to have the product available for consumers to get access to it. I think when the pandemic originally started, it's not that the inventories were low, but we just weren't expecting the demand for certain goods. And then you saw it kind of get out of the our fulfillment centers right away. And then we obviously had issues because of the pandemic getting it into North America and Europe. So it's really, we're trying to strategize, learn, take what we learned from the pandemic, understand the conditions that we're experiencing now, and what will it be like over the next few years, and how can we avoid obviously adding any additional costs that we maybe did incur during the pandemic, while continuing to have solutions for our suppliers. I mean, in the end, if we can't get the goods from the ports to the fulfillment centers, we're going to fail our suppliers, and they're going to look for other solutions. So that's kind of where we saw is obviously data visibility and speed to market for the goods.
Yeah, the pandemic comes along. You can't really forecast that huge disruption in the market. You go from really, you mentioned not low inventories, but really just in time, lean, efficient, Six Sigma, if you say, inventory levels, to just a whole different world, a whole different business model during the pandemic, because part of the pandemic, you're just trying to get as much inventory over as possible because it's getting sold. When we look at changes in how people view inventory levels, supply chain through the pandemic, do you think we'll see structural changes that'll last for a generation, or do you think once everything calms down, people might revert back to the status quo? Certainly, investor sentiment, investment pressures, pressures. What do you think, or do you think it's going to be somewhere in the middle?
We believe it's going to be somewhere in the middle. You did see a pretty significant shift, obviously, with the some of the dynamics in the North America from the West Coast to the East Coast. We do feel that it will go, you will see some shift go back to the West Coast, but I do think companies like us have learned that you just can't have one entry point into North America or Europe, that you have to have many solutions, especially when you're attacking the inland markets, anything to do with rail. So while we do feel that certain companies will continue to utilize the West Coast just because of the transit time and the rates, a lot of other companies understand that the cost that they incurred because of port fluidity, lack of equipment, so on and so forth, it's gonna really put pressure on people to have different entry points, if you may, to get to the Chicago markets, to get to Cincinnati, get to KC. And then, as you said, the price point, what is most important? Do we need to get to the West Coast and we got to get it out to the consumer immediately? Or can we, maybe maximize the East Coast and, the transit time obviously being significantly longer? Do we feel that it's still going to get to the fulfillment centers and the end customer in a adequate enough time, and the savings would be there and less opportunity for hiccups to occur that could cause disruption in the supply chain? So we do feel like some habits are going to go back. I think also every company has a different consumer base, and it's really understanding what do your consumers want and how can you execute and how can you provide it to them where they don't see the difference if the transit's longer.
Yeah, I think some ports on the East Coast or outside of LA and Long Beach saw market share gains. I think they'll give a little bit of that back, but I think at the end of the pandemic that some part of that increase in market share is going to be very sticky.
It is. I think the Gulf region is a good example where it's really gone up on the TEUs. New York obviously is the largest port of entry right now, looking at it separately from LA and Long Beach. So I do think there's a lot of value. I think the East Coast, obviously the population concentration is there, but the network is very concentrated also. So the rails and the Class 1s have been investing a lot of money into expanding so they could do double stacks, so on and so forth, to kind of penetrate those markets. But the West Coast of transit time is so attractive, and just getting the speed to market is very valuable. So for us to get to Chicago, Cincinnati, the Canadian ports, we're going to continue to have 3 entry points where previously, pre-pandemic, we weren't as diverse on the entry points.
And that brings, if you have multiple entry points, that brings in a whole new modeling of a supply chain, right? It brings in a little bit more complexity as you build a plan for the ports of entries, how to move inland to order the most optimal routes, which entails. Right. It entails that it's going to be a little bit more complicated. There's going to be new analysis created and made, and probably some technology or tools that will probably be invented and brought to market to address those needs.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, it's going to be more complicated, but the supply chain is complicated. I don't think there's a lot of visibility or the difficulty of getting goods from Asia to a market such as Europe, South America, North America, wherever you go. But I don't think anyone could sustain the amount of friction that we felt during the pandemic again. I think some companies are going to feel very, I don't want to say confident, but maybe they feel that they have better data points that they could predictively, predict any issues going forward. But for us at Wayfair, we got to service the supplier, we have to service the customer. So we don't feel that's the best strategy for what we do, but for other goods, they may feel it could be beneficial. But I also think the data, just everyone has so much access to data now. You can make educated decisions, and you could kind of become more nimble than you had prior. So yes, it's going to be a lot more, it will be more difficult, but if you have good data, you have individuals that understand the industry, you should be able to be more proactive than reactive like we've seen.
And let's hope we don't see a bigger shock to the system anytime soon than we saw in 2020 and 2021.
I agree. I think I saw one article today by Rachel about the owner operators. I mean, I think that's something the people in the industry have to pay attention to. You've seen the ocean rates decline pretty significantly. You have seen the landside rates decline, but the cost of operating a tractor in both Europe and in North America is skyrocketing. Fuel, continues to be pretty high. The cost for parts for the trucks, the lack of individuals going into the industry is making it where the rates on the land side aren't falling down as drastically as the ocean. And I don't want to say it hit a floor, but you are seeing the difficulty if the market doesn't come up and contractors can make a decent living. I mean, they're going to have to exit the industry and go into a different field. So that's kind of what we're paying attention to, and just being a good partner and trying to express to not only the ocean carriers, but the land side what we're expecting. And as you said, what can we do to be better? What can we do to make your life easier so we can drive down that price point?
Yeah, the problem with finding a floor is that you can lie on that floor for quite a long time without getting up again, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
You mentioned that. You mentioned the ocean market. What are you seeing in the ocean market here in early 2023? What's kind of the prognosis or the outlook from your point of view?
Yeah, we've all seen the ocean rates fall. We do believe they're normalizing. Can it go lower? If I had a crystal ball, I would probably have my own show on this on FreightWaves. But we are seeing the rates fall. We do think they're going to normalize, and with congestion easing, especially along the ports, maybe the rails are having a little bit more difficulty with fluidity. We do think they're going to hopefully maybe dip a little bit lower, but we think it kind of hit the bottom on what carriers need to operate.
Yeah, and on demand forecasting, do you see? Let's talk about the economy as a whole. Do you see demand kind of finding a normalization as well? Like I don't want to say new normal, right? Or post-pandemic, or back into a more normal seasonality and functionality that we all experienced until 2020.
Yeah, I think over the next few weeks with Lunar New Year being over, I think you're going to really see how the imports are coming down. We're very... we like the recent retail information that came out that it did grow, so that was great to see. So we are expecting more normalized demand from our suppliers and from our consumers. But however, like you said, credit card debt continues to increase. Inflation, while it is somewhat under control, it doesn't seem like we've kind of hit the ceiling there. I think in Europe, obviously, certain countries are affecting it more than others. So in North America, in both markets, we're very positive on the future, and we do think it's going to be more normalized. 2023 may be a little bit lower than people expect, but we are very optimistic, at least on the Wayfair side, and especially for 24 and continued growth for us.
Yeah, 2023 will be strange, and getting back into a more 2024, which should be normalized. When you talk to whether it's ocean carriers or air carriers, domestic transportation, what have been some of the changes in perspective or how they approach companies like Wayfair, to do deals or negotiate? How's that changed? How are your transportation partners? What's their outlook? How are they approaching sales right now?
Yeah, relationships have always mattered to Wayfair and Castlegate, but we are seeing a lot of providers want more exposure to multiple levels of our organization, just not at my level, not at my director who oversees our global and landside procurement, but also on the C-suite. So you are seeing companies trying to understand more. What does my customer do? What can they need help with? How can I provide value? So that's one thing that we've seen, but I think a lot of other companies are starting to mimic that. Not that we were the first to do it, but I think we're one of the ones that really showed value to our vendors that, hey, it's just not what you could do for me, but it's got to be mutual gain. So that's one aspect. Also, I think you're seeing a lot on the ocean and on the dray side. Vendors coming in, they don't need all your book of business. They want business that's more predictable so they can control their costs. I think that's a big thing that we're seeing. It's give us what you think is certain. Work with us on the forecast. And we understand, especially for Wayfair, that consumer demand is going to play a huge role in what we're importing. But if you could really break down that barrier of communication and be honest with each other, gain that trust, there's a lot of value to it, and that's what we're seeing on the vendor side.
Another trend that we're seeing coming out of the pandemic because of the risk to supply chains, so the risk of long transit times, if nothing else, from Asia, is both nearshoring, coming back to North America, or that be Mexico or maybe South America, and reshoring, which is coming back into the USA for manufacturing production of whatever goods, right? Is that a trend that you're seeing out in the landscape when it comes to, or other retailers and manufacturers out there? Is that something that, what are your thoughts, I guess, on that trend?
Yeah, it's a hot topic whenever we're at conferences or we're interacting with BCOs and NVOs. It's kind of, where do we see the future? We can't just be concerned about 2024. We have to be concerned about 2025, 2026, 2030. I think you've seen a lot of textiles obviously go into Central America. We did see some diversification in Asia, where it was Malaysia and Vietnam, with consumer goods that we sell on our website. I personally can say I do believe that as transit increase, the costs increase. You're seeing, I would say, wages in Asia increase, where it doesn't really make sense. Once you bundle it all up, you may get the same cost advantage in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. So, short answer, yes, I do think some will come back to the Western Hemisphere, North America, Central America, South America, if possible. But you're still going to have certain products that it just makes sense for it to be produced in Asia. And, whether it's moving the lumber over to Asia, they produce the goods and it comes back. I mean, it's always going to come down to price, unfortunately. And the consumer is kind of the one that dictates how we should, I shouldn't say they dictate, but they have a large say in how we should procure our suppliers.
Yeah, buying habits are definitely, and it's a long process, right? You just don't pull out of Asia and move to South America or back to the U.S. Overnight. So it's a long process, and I have a feeling, personally, humans have very short memories. And I'm thinking by the time 25, 26, 27, the pandemic and all the chaos in supply chains will be in the distant, ancient past that no one can hardly remember anymore. And investors will be clamoring at companies to run lean, run efficiently, source from Asia, and we'll go kind of cycle back right to where we're at until the next shock.
I do think it's true. I know I could say I do believe a lot of C-suites now understand what drayage is. They understand what a container is. They know what per diem is. So if anything good came out of the pandemic and what we've experienced lately, I mean, it is, I think, the education of supply chain and transportation. It's been brought to the forefront. I think a lot of companies now are really using that to their advantage. If you have a I don't want to say complex supply chain, but if you have a supply chain that is well-oiled, maintained, you have good individuals behind the scenes operating, you have the connections, the C-suite will continue to push that. I mean, I do agree. I think people have a short memory. However, this may have left a lasting imprint on a lot of people's minds. So I hope people don't go back to their old habits. And if they do, I hope they're our competitors.
Yeah, and I think there's room for a very lean, well-oiled supply chain with a little bit of robustness in there, a little bit of redundancies to, as you might call, a margin of error, because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. And if you just leave a little bit of margin of error in your supply chain, then you can take advantages of when things are disrupted, which they happen. Maybe not as severely as pandemic, but they do happen.
Yeah, and we see that too. That's where we did invest some of our own assets. We procured our own chassis. That was one thing that we didn't want to spend too much capital on, but we did see the value of, once again, controlling our own destiny. When the container hits New York, if it hits Savannah, wherever it is, we want to make sure that we have a chassis for that container to get on, and then we could get into our fulfillment center. So we are investing in areas that make sense, that we're not going to really expose ourselves to any margin loss, that also produces a better customer experience.
And I think you hit the nail on the head right there, and that's the moral of the story and the interview is is controlling your own destiny. Now, however you run, you can run as lean as you want to, you can run as redundant as you want to, but as long as you're controlling your own destiny, you are in a position to create a competitive advantage with your supply chain. If you don't control your own destiny, then there's no way in the world, there's no chance that your supply chain is going to be a competitive advantage.
No way. And it starts with communication, as you stated earlier. I mean, you really need to know how to communicate with your suppliers and vendors. So
definitely
couldn't agree more.
Well, Jack, thanks for dropping by. Put that coffee down here on Global Supply Chain Week, and all the best to you and Wayfair, and have a great 2023.
Great. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
You bet. That's Jack Echeverria from Wayfair talking about the pandemic and lessons learned. We have a great afternoon coming up here on Global Supply Chain Week. We're going to talk a little bit about global supply chain risks with Eric Coolidge, and also Put That Coffee Down. You can download it on Freightcast or Put That Coffee Down wherever you download your podcasts. But this wraps it for this episode. We'll see you next week.
FreightWaves is the #1 source for transportation and logistics news. FreightWaves.com provides you with in-depth news coverage, data, and insights from the leading industry journalists and market experts. On FreightWaves.com, you can also watch the only streaming TV network dedicated to freight. FreightWaves TV provides you with coverage you won't find anywhere else. However you like your news delivered, check us out online or on the FreightWaves app.
All right, everybody, welcome back to FreightWaves Global Supply Chain Week, day #1. Maritime Day is already almost over, Anthony. I can't believe it went so fast.
That's right, and I mean, it's been amazing content, and I'm thankful that we can go back and watch all this content on demand. If you go to tv.freightwaves.com, and we just heard from the legendary Kevin Hill, and that was an amazing episode, as always, of Put That Coffee Down.
Absolutely. So that episode of Put That Coffee Down and all of Kevin's other episodes can be found on demand, as Anthony mentioned. You can also catch them in our app or on our YouTube channel by heading on over to FreightWave or to youtube.com/FreightWaves, that is. And that's where the majority of our shows live also. So you can find them lots of different places. It's been a great Tuesday, Anthony. And speaking of great Tuesdays, we've got a really exciting event coming up next week as well.
That's right. So we're going to have our very own founder and CEO, Craig Fuller, and Zach Strickland, head of Freight Market Intelligence, and they're going to be hosting a live on-air webinar around the state of freight. And they've been doing a few of these lately, and they have been an absolute success with really giving a lot of insight to the entire freight and supply chain community.
Absolutely. Last month's State of Freight was all about where the market currently is. This one is about preparing for market changes as we head kind of to the end of Q1 and start getting into a point where I think most experts are saying, hey, we could probably start to see a market flip by the second half of the year. So make sure that you head on over to live.freightwaves.com to get registered for that webinar. We still have plenty more coming up for the rest of today. We've got two more fireside chats. And Anthony, we have to give away a door prize today.
That's right. And you're only eligible if you go and get registered at live.freightwaves.com. So if you have been watching on LinkedIn, we appreciate your support. Thank you so much for tuning in. But if you want the full experience, go to live.freightwaves.com, get registered there. You won't be able to sneak in for this giveaway for today, but you will be eligible for the giveaways in the upcoming days because this is Global Supply Chain Week, and we're not just airing today, but we're airing tomorrow and Thursday as well.
Absolutely. 2 more days possible for those giveaways. Speaking of tomorrow, we've got another edition of FreightWaves now coming up embedded into your Global Supply Chain Week Day 2 coverage. Day 2, going to be a great one. I'm headlining your keynote speech tomorrow, talking all about CPG, food and beverage, retail, all of that wrapped into one. This is what we're looking at for tomorrow. And then Thursday, we've got Michael Loscheller. Tomorrow's going to be Matt Cicinelli from HelloFresh. It's going to be a great one. And like I said, plenty more coming up.
That's right. And I might say I'm really excited for your keynote and Day 2 because it's going to be an aspect that really not just impacts everyone in the supply chain, but really everyday consumers at a whole.
Absolutely. So make sure that you tune in for that. That starts tomorrow, again, live at 9 a.m. Got to give a big shout out to our Universal event sponsor, Roadrunner, for their help and support putting on this event. These events don't happen without the love of our sponsors, so thank you guys so much. Also, shout out to Roadrunner for just being awesome and being a great company putting their name out there. That's it for us right now. We're going to move into this final block of fireside chats. When we come back, we will give away a door prize. Enjoy this block.
Welcome to another session of Global Supply Chain Week. We're looking at the state of the supply chains and trade coming out of the pandemic. I'm Eric Kulish, Air Cargo and Supply Chain Editor at FreightWaves. I'm joined today by Walter Kempsey, Managing Partner at the Kempsey Group. He's a renowned trade economist who spends a lot of time on freight transportation and infrastructure. Walter, welcome to the FreightWaves virtual chat.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So there's so much going on in the news and in the global economy. Let's dive right into it. I wanted to get a sense of, how you think of how the economy is progressing heading into 2023. It's been kind of a very uncertain year, very choppy, different types of signals of slow growth or positivity with the job market. But, so give us a sense of how you think that's impacting freight costs. And at the same time, a lot of the forecasts are, based on lessons learned from the pandemic. So do you think, shippers, freight companies, and governments have taken any lessons from the pandemic, analyzed the data properly, and are making better decisions now?
Yeah. So let me to answer that. Let me do a little looking back, and then we'll look forward. But looking back, historically, we don't have a lot of data on this, but basically, global pandemics kind of burn out within a couple of years. And so, back in the second quarter of 2020, there was massive panic, and a massive overreaction. The basic premise was that we would never go to stores again. We would never travel again. We would never gather in groups again, which was really bizarre to me, because if you look back to, say, the Spanish flu, 1918 to 1920, it took 2 years for the virus to mutate into something that didn't kill its host. Because if a virus doesn't mutate into something that doesn't kill its host, the virus will die out. That's just math. It's not. Not theory or anything. It's just that's how life propagates. So we've had a whole bunch of near misses, but this time the viruses that threatened the pandemic came out of China rather than Hong Kong, and China made a horrible policy error by lying through its teeth about what was happening, and then trying to hide it as if that would make the problem go away. So that childish reaction to the pandemic was a real surprise to me. But I'll talk about some other surprises. But once this got in place, and we were told we'd have a vaccine by early 2021, which we did, we started to see consumers, shift from this everything from home behavior because they were forced to, not because they wanted to. And that was a very important interpretation to make, because people did not want to stay home day and night. There's even demand to go to the office, maybe not, all 5 days a week, but a lot of our previous patterns of behavior we were doing because we liked what we did.
How did the government and maybe other companies misread that, and how they applied it to supply chains?
Yeah, well, let's just start off with everybody believed that was going to be the case. So all of these companies that benefited from people doing more from home, they overinvested. And basically, we even had this spike in the share of retail sales for e-commerce. It was around 11%. It shot up to about 16%. And then a lot of the companies, big e-commerce companies, forecast off the peak. Look, I've got a degree in forecasting, and I can tell you one of the biggest mistakes you can make is forecast off of a historically, a historic new peak. You have to be very careful with that. And so that misinterpretation resulted in way too much investment by tech companies, by day trading companies, platforms, bicycles. You make the list, right? So all the guys who won during the pandemic eventually would have to lose when we reverted back to our previous behavior. And the easiest way to have monitored that is you didn't need big data and all of that. All you needed was to go to the TSA website, once a week, pull down the last 7 days of how many people were processed at the airports and compare it to 2019, 2018. And that told you a lot right then and there. As soon as the vaccines became available, December 2020, January 21, you saw all of a sudden, vaccines were being given. Some people didn't want to take them, but that's fine. We started to see people traveling again, and the number of people traveling every day, just on average, because you have to correct for holidays and all that, but it was increasing on a pretty linear fashion. And so why you would still go out there and order tons of things for people to do from home when very clearly people wanted to get the hell away from home and go do anything else was surprising. So basically, the big companies were the ones who were able to go to the spot market when they wanted more stuff and pay $30,000 for a 40-foot container. But the smaller retailers, the mid-market size retailers, the really small retailers, they didn't have that kind of a balance sheet. So they're not the ones who overordered. And if you look at the time series for general merchandise companies, their inventory to sales ratio, and you look at the retailers, which includes the big companies, but also scores of little ones, and the big companies are a minority. So the retailers' inventory to sales ratio is more a reflection of what's happening to the smaller companies. Both of them went from $1.40 a month of sales, of inventory to $1 of sales per month. They dropped to $1.20. The big guys did. The smaller ones went to $1.10. And then they worked very hard over the next year and a half to get back up. The larger companies overshot. Their inventory to sales ratio for them went to $1.60. And the smaller ones went from $1.20 to $1.30, but from $1.10 to $1.30, but they're struggling to get back to $1.40. China remained shut during COVID in some insane bid to prevent COVID, from spreading, which we know wasn't going to work in the first place. So we still haven't seen the smaller retailers rebuild their inventories to where it needs to be, but the larger ones are very stuffed. Their warehouses are stuffed, and what they're doing is taking containers and just handing it to downstream discount retailers because there's just literally no room at the end for more stuff. So it's not surprising then that we have a declining volume of imported containers. And it's not surprising to see reports that the retailers, especially the larger ones, are still canceling purchase orders from Asia.
But do you think there's if the recession's mild, as some are thinking, and
Oh, wait. Before we go there, I just want to add something. So that's what I was saying in late 2021. In March of 2022, the big retailers had to admit they had too much inventory, and they started cutting their purchase orders. There is a 7-month lag between the time when purchase orders start being cut and the volumes drop, because that's how long it takes for you to, when you place an order, to get that container to show up at the port. And so 7 months later, we expected a transportation recession, and it started pretty much right on time in October. And for the last 3 months of the year, we've seen a decline in port container volumes. So that's the transportation recession. So there were two things that were surprising to me in this. The first was that the Federal Reserve, for some unimaginable reason, thinks that the inflation is the result of something they can on the demand side, and it isn't. So it was surprising to me that the Fed thought that if they raise interest rates, they will cure the inflation problem. It's not true. The inflation problem was a supply side problem. We had truck driver rates going through the roof. Those peaked last summer. We had wage growth rates peaking last year in March at 5.6%, and then it started to drop each month. Energy prices shot through the roof because of the Ukraine-Russia war. Ag prices went through the roof, partly because of horrible weather. All the rivers were way down across the northern hemisphere, Asia, North America, Europe. And then, and finally, when you look at these cost components, it's pretty obvious why we had, companies had to raise prices to consumers. It was either that or start losing profits.
Well, Walter, wasn't it both ways? I mean, obviously there was a huge supply component to the increased costs, but the consumers had a lot of extra money from the COVID relief bills, from the Trump administration, tax cuts and other savings. So, I mean, there was a demand or a consumer, a monetary portion of that inflation too, wasn't there?
Well, yeah, to a small extent, yes. I mean, yes, you did get money from the federal government. The Federal Reserve was very liberal with its policies, but basically all that happened is consumers had shifted from spending 70% of their money on services and 30% on goods to 67% on services and 33% on goods. And consumer spending is 70% of the economy. So these small shifts are trillions of dollars of GDP. So, but they shifted. So they just weren't going out. They were just staying home. They were buying things to do from home. They weren't out and about and eating at restaurants, staying at hotels, etc. So, it was more of a pivot of consumer spending that we saw. That's what created the congestion at the ports, at the railroads, at the warehouses. But most of the causes of the inflation came from the supply side. The inflation didn't really pick up until very late in 2021. So we had gone through a good year or more of this massive shift in consumer spending, and you didn't see the inflation. And, another example of the distortion that the Fed's not catching on to is last month we had a huge jump in employment and inflation dropped. The inflation rate, I think the PCE dropped from over 6% to 4% or in that range. The CPI did the same thing. That's what you focus on. The relationships between the macroeconomic variables have been distorted since we shut down the economy. And they're still kind of going back to some kind of stable relationship. But basically, inflation went down, employment jumped a lot, and everybody and the Fed thinks they're going to have to raise interest rates again to reduce inflation. Why? Inflation's already dropping. The congestion that we had at the ports, that's gone away. But by raising interest rates, you're not going to stop the Russian-Ukrainian war, which resulted in higher wheat prices because Russia blockaded Ukraine. By raising interest rates, you're not going to lower energy prices. You're not going to encourage investment in energy infrastructure. I mean, that is happening because of the demand from Europe. But By raising interest rates, you're not solving that problem. We had problems with the weather last year. We didn't grow enough food as much as we normally do. Raising interest rates isn't going to fix the climate. I don't know what these people are thinking. Plus, the Federal Reserve doesn't seem to understand that the Census Bureau's forecast for the working age population call for an average increase of 300,000 workers over the next 10 years, added to the labor force. That's nothing. Last month, 500,000 people employed. Last year, on average, 250,000. So as far as I can tell, we had a big supply problem that's being resolved. And as we resolve the supply problem, the inflation pressures will go away. And the Fed has made a number of mistakes in the past. Like in the 70s, they were, pumping money to the economy.
Let's not go that far back.
No, but it's important to look at it in that context. In the 70s, we didn't have oil. There was the Arab oil embargo.
Yeah.
And the Fed's response to that was to print a lot of money. Let's stimulate demand and we will avoid a recession. Yeah, well, you created a lot of inflation because the problem was oil. By printing money and lowering interest rates, you're not going to produce more oil. And that's the Fed historically has not understood that sometimes the data you're looking at are supply-driven and not demand-driven. And this goes for economists in general. I would.
What about the labor situation? You referenced that. As you said, hiring is still strong, but so many jobs at either ports or airports or at retail companies aren't being filled, and so that adds the extra costs and inefficiencies. How long is it going to take till people kind of get back in the job sector fully after the pandemic?
Right. Okay. So let's start off with the premise that we don't really have a lot of workers out there. We're very, very short workers. Unemployment rate is at a 60-year low, 3.4%. We need 5% if you really want some stability, but 3.4 is going to choke our growth. So what's happened is when the pandemic started, we fired all these people from services, laid them off, even though a lot of companies were paid by the government not to lay people off. They did it anyways. And I'll come back to that in a second. So all those laid off workers, fortunately, could get jobs in warehouses and distribution centers and other things to support the physical goods supply chain. And now they overhired them, and we've seen some of the bigger retailers out there laying off staff, et cetera, mostly white collar, but nonetheless. And we've got the service sector struggling to hire enough people so we can get back to flying the same number of airplanes, running the same number of trucks and trains, trains that we did before. Right now, we're not back to pre-pandemic numbers of people flying, but mostly because we can't staff the airlines and the airports yet fully to be able to get back to those numbers. So I told you there were two surprises to me. One of them was the Federal Reserve's, policies. The second thing that surprised me is the large number of bad decisions that were made, starting with interpreting 2020 as a permanent shift in human behavior, and then extended to overhiring, to buying too much real estate. So the mistakes that I think the Fed is making have been extended by a lot of corporate leaders. So there's been a lot of misinterpretation about what's been going on. We could add a third surprise, and that was China. China's COVID policy was bizarre to me.
So that's good. So that is another potential mistake. The Chinese kind of miscalculated or, took a different approach than the rest of the world. But now they've totally shifted. They're trying to dig out of that and open up quickly. And now they're having a lot of COVID outbreaks there. So going forward, how do you see that impacting supply chains? Will the factories and the exports get up to speed relatively quickly, or will these COVID, outbreaks in China keep holding things back?
That one's a little hard to interpret because, we figured that once you open, you let alley-oop, everybody out, right? The problem is as soon as everybody was let loose, the virus spread rapidly across the country, as was to be expected. And it's made staffing factories, et cetera, just as difficult as it was in 2020. Unfortunately, China didn't have the good judgment to go and buy the vaccines that work from foreign manufacturers. China tried to go it on its own, and it's not developed enough to be able to do that. The correct action would have been to simply buy 1 billion or 2 billion Moderna or Pfizer vaccines and inoculate everybody and minimize the impact. So we're going to have, we started last part of last year, once the COVID, restrictions were lifted, we'll probably see until this coming summer a lot of problems with the supply chain coming out of China. I think we're going to have wave after wave of people getting sick and factories not being able to fully staff. And there may be a lot of hesitation also to return to factories. Some folks may go back to the rural provinces and stay there rather than remain in the more urban areas and run the risk of catching COVID. So unless China does the right thing and starts buying vaccines that works for their population. But the problem is that I think the acceleration of shifting from sourcing from China could also stymie some of that growth. Companies that I know and I talk with and that I work with, they are rapidly trying to relocate their supply chains. So, and then between that and the Uyghur forced labor, enforcements that are going on, I think to date we're probably close to $1 trillion or something like that of goods being impacted. I forgot what the number. $1 billion. I beg your pardon. $1 billion worth of electronics and other related goods, being seized under the Uyghur, accusations. That's another problem for imports from China.
Yeah, so definitely the China trade situation, it'll be something to watch and an ongoing, up and down, journey there with slowdowns potentially in lots of areas. So, well, listen, Walter, that's about all the time we have. We have to leave it there. I want to thank you for being our guest today.
All right. Thank you so much. Great to be here. Thanks, Eric.
Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying Global Supply Chain Week. My name is Greg Miller. I'm a senior editor with FreightWaves and American Shipper. And I am speaking with Patrick Berglund, the CEO of Zanetta, joining us all the way from Oslo, Norway. Patrick, great to speak with you. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, good to see you again, Greg, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so we are going to be speaking about ocean freight rates, both short-term rates and long-term rates. But before we get to that, Patrick, tell us a little bit about Zanetta and what it does.
Yeah, Zanetta collects primarily market rates for ocean and air freight. And our key source for that data is the BCO and the shipper side. So we go to the buyer side and we get their long-term contracts. And we also work with the carriers, we work with the forwarders, and also collect the short-term data. Now, all of this data, alongside reliability data, capacity data, emission data, we put into our platform to provide market intelligence that these players can use to make better decisions.
All right, so let's start out on the short-term spot side, and since we're going to be talking about actual rates, let's date this conversation. We're speaking on February 8th. Now, on the short-term side, let's begin with the big Asia-US market, the Asia West Coast spot market. And if I think back to last year, it went, these rates went down through the year. I think in the spring, they sort of surprised people by not coming down faster. And then in August and September and October, they surprised people by coming down very, very fast. They seem to have stabilized a bit late November, December, and January. Looking at your data, what did you see with the Asia West Coast short-term market, and do you believe that we've hit the bottom?
Well, it's hard to argue that we're at least not close to the bottom, because the alternatives now starts to become more or less for cheap, right? If I look at the spot market average, right, you get around $1,500 US, but if you look at the lower end of the market, it's closing in on $1,000 per 40-foot container. So it's not a lot more here for the carriers to give. And obviously, historically, we've seen them sell at the loss-making rates. So I'm not saying necessarily it's the bottom, but from a sustainability point of view, considering that the shippers, the BCOs would like the carriers to be around, we're getting into a painful area on the spot market. That being said, their wallets are quite sizable, considering the previous 2 years. That's been quite a boom for them.
Yeah, so let's look at a totally different example as a contrast. The Europe to East Coast transatlantic westbound. This market has behaved completely differently. It peaked later, and it's coming down fast, but it's still, as of today, way above pre-COVID levels. What's your data showing on that market, and why do you think that's behaved so differently?
Well, from a pattern point of view, it looks very similar, just with the time lag. And we had that when the significant increases started to come around. We could see that as well. Not all trade lanes move at once at the same point of time, but there's a few things happening here, right? First and foremost, I want to point out that it's significantly softening, both on the contract side and on the spot market side. And especially if you look at the lower end of the spot market, that's where they really started to give in now. And we can see that sort of falling off very quickly from the peak that we've had mid last year. Now, there's a few things. There's been, for instance, U.S. importers looking for alternatives to source cargo coming out of Far East Asia, right? So demand has been sort of artificially high. Then on the supply side, there's fewer shipping lines operating on this trade, or there's two carriers controlling such a portion of the market that it's arguably a little bit easier to prohibit the significant fall in the shorter run. Inevitably, it comes around for this trade as well, especially considering that you want to reposition some of your capacity that doesn't yield that kind of profit on the Trans-Pacific or Asia to Europe anymore, and you put it onto these trades, and then you create that sort of overcapacity situation on these trades as well. And that's why it's softening now, but with the delay because of some of these previous conditions that I mentioned. So just to give you some numbers, we're seeing average spot market going from $8,600, $700 to sitting at today at $5,004. So that's quite a significant drop, but the lower end of the market sits at $3,009. So the spread between what the average spot market price is and the lower end is pretty significant in this case.
Yeah, and when we talk about spot rates, the conversation inevitably turns to carrier capacity management and their ability to blank sailings and put a floor on all this. I mean, as they did so well in the second quarter of 2020 during the initial COVID lockdowns, there's been some people that think they haven't been quite as aggressive as they could have been towards the end of last year. Are you seeing anything on capacity management that makes you feel one way or the other on how they're doing it this time around?
Let's first linger a little bit on 2020, because I find that interesting, because I agree with what you're saying, but I'm wondering whether it was a move of fear when COVID hit. We all expected consumption to drop significantly, right? Rightfully so, given what we forecasted to be the future here. But what happened is that they pulled out as much as they could because they were scared that the volumes wouldn't be there. But then it turned out it was more volumes than in a normal market, significantly more over time. And that's what's created the squeeze rather than necessarily shrewd business behavior, right? And this time around, it's almost a little bit opposite, because now it's less volume than anybody anticipated, and they can't quickly enough pull out the capacity, even though they know that that's the recipe to turn this around, right? And I think we're seeing significant blankings, right? But we do not see enough. And with the fact that there's a lot of shippers that stocked up heavily over the last, I would say even 12 months in order to try and deal with the supply chain issues they had in the previous 18 to 24 months. And now they're sort of emptying as much stock as they possibly can, because they're looking at a weaker economy and for themselves as well, which gives almost an artificially low demand side for the carriers to operate with. And one final item I would also like to sort of point out is that going through COVID, there was so many that sort of, bought a new oven or any kitchen appliances or whatever, but there's so many products that you don't need 2 and 3 of, right? And this is now kind of creating an artificial reduction in demand, because we've kind of brought forward a lot of the stuff that we would buy more on average in a normal market. And that is a very hard market to operate in for the carriers at the moment. And it's very tough to balance supply with demand, and that's the challenge they're facing. And we're not seeing significant measures applied in order to turn the market around for now.
Yeah, I mean, before we get to long-term rates, you brought up the point of demand, and I want to get into that a little bit more. I mean, because there is this, debate over what's happening here. To what extent is this demand that's been lost due to some sort of economic pressure or what have you, and to what extent is this a timing issue, an inventory situation? And I know that you speak a lot and do various surveys with your customers and business partners, and I'm wondering, where do they, before we get to the long-term rates, where do they stand on demand? Because this goes to, how 2023 could play out.
Yeah, and I think we're polling our audience or our customer base on a monthly basis, asking these questions. What's your expectations in terms of your annual volumes? And there's a significant portion, about a third, that is seeing or expecting reduced volumes for 2023, right? So it's debatable whether we're going in for a soft landing or whether we're going to see recession and all of that. It still remains to be seen a little bit. But what I think is pretty obvious is that it takes quite some time for everything to sort of wash through the system, which means that I think we will see reduced demand for 2023, maybe into 2024, and then we will see sort of a stronger market again, because then consumption might pick up again in terms of being enough that it has a positive impact for the carriers. That being said, I think most people are not aware of the fact that the market was actually more volatile pre-pandemic than it was through the pandemic. If you measure volatility as percentage movement per day, the only thing that happened through the pandemic is just moved in one direction, first upwards and then just downwards to extreme levels. But what we're looking at now is a market, if it returns to somewhat of the pre-pandemic one, we return to a market that is much more unstable on a daily basis, either up or down in terms of percentage movements. And that's a tricky market to operate in, which is going to create a lot of confusion and uncertainties on the buy side in particular. But I think we're going to be within a much lower bandwidth until, let's say, mid-2024 than what we've seen historically, especially over the last few years, of course.
Okay, so let's turn to the long-term rates where, Zaneta really has a lot of insight. First, on the 2022 Trans-Pacific rates that, many of which were negotiated May to May, there's been some conflicting reports on how they've held. In that market, the spot rates went well below the contract rates that were negotiated last year. And in certain cases, for example, Zim on their conference calls, they were quite open about the fact that, they went to their long-term customers and they negotiated those long-term rates down in mid-contract to compensate for the drop in the spot rates. And then you heard sort of a different message on the Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk calls, where they were basically saying that their contract rates held. And looking at the fourth quarter results of Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk that just came out, it does look like they did largely hold on at least on their contracts. But your data really provides a lot of insight on this, and I'm wondering what you're seeing, sticking to the 2022 contracts that may still be in play here. To what extent do you see them holding or crumbling?
Well, absolutely. We see a combination of it all, just to be clear. Some will completely renegotiate and insist on that. Some carriers didn't budge and agreed to that in the first attempt, second attempt, but maybe moved in the third attempt from the shippers, right? Or the BCOs. And then we see BCOs whose delivered some of the volume to the contracts and moved some on the spot market. And then we've seen others who's just been completely loyal to whatever contract they had, right? So it's a huge spread between the behavior of the BCOs. Some have been waiting to stick it back to the carriers, and others have remained very loyal and consider more a long-term partnership sort of mindset to this, right? Now, through this period, if you look at the lower end of the contract market, there are players who hasn't seen remotely the same price increases as the average players, right? Just to be clear, right? So there's substantial price increases on the short-term average and long-term average, and also on the lower end of it, but not nearly what these other reference points are showing. Now, as the market has gone down, the lower end of the market, long-term market, still sits below the short-term average. That means that big volume US importers in this example is still paying below the market average spot. But if you apply the spot short-term low end to this equation, then they get sort of balanced, right? So those who achieve the best spot rates versus those who have the best or the lowest paying, lowest sitting long-term rates, those find themselves today in approximately the same area. What I think is interesting is that you're absolutely right that to some extent, Q4 long-term rates held up. But if I look at what's happened from December to January, the average has gone from $5,500 to $3,700, and then dropping again in February to $2,600. That is quite a quick, rapid decline of the long-term rates as well. So by the time they start reporting Q1 results, we're going to see a big change in that from what we saw in Q4.
Yeah, and looking at the timing here, I mean, I understand that, not all annual contracts are negotiated on this schedule of Asia, Europe, January 1st, Asia, US, May 1st, but a lot of them are. And, I assume then that the Asia, Europe, January 1st process is pretty much concluded here. And I'm wondering, have you seen anything? And I understand this is a different market than Asia US, but do you see anything in what happened on the Asia Europe negotiation process that we can sort of glean anything for and get any messages for the the upcoming Asia US contract negotiations?
Yeah, it's been a downward pressure all the way for the long-term contracts since the peak in 2022 as well. But if I just look at it since September, right, the end of Q3, and then looking at what has happened when Q3 was wrapped up and what has happened when Q4 was wrapped up going into this year, we see like two major steps down. One that is going from like $9,000 average for the long-term contract down to $6,800. And then another step down to 2,900, right? And then in Feb, there's even more long-term contracts coming into play that is dragging this market average for long-term down to 2,400. So if you look at that in percentage terms, that is reducing those rates with 72% since September until February. So, pretty obvious to expect the same movements on the Trans-Pacific one, but I do want to highlight that those long-term rates that we can already see from that sort of peaked in May, April last year is non-existing in February on the Trans-Pacific one, and that one is down with 69% already. So there is not a lot more to push down when we get to April, May.
Yeah, and was just listening to the Maersk call today, and they predicted that they see throughout the year that contract rates are ultimately going to come down and converge with spot rates. But from your perspective, I wonder if you have any thoughts, just in general, on if you're looking at where contract rates are going to be, percentage-wise this year versus the peak of 2022. How significantly do you see them falling, and do you see them still being above the sort of the 2019 pre-COVID, or going all the way back?
No, it's more or less all the way back now. We're talking about marginal differences, and even if you go back to 18, 17, you'll find peaks that are way above what we're currently looking at. So on these trades, and not the transatlantic one, right? This is important to understand. On these two front hauls that we're discussing, Asia, Europe, Asia, US, we're already give or take back to pre-COVID levels. And then especially if you talk about pre-COVID levels to be more than just 2019, right? So I expect them to drop down to short-term market average, but from there, the big volume BCOs are not satisfied. If the spot market stays there, they will require a discount versus small volume importers and exporters, right? And that's something historically the carriers have agreed to because they move more volume and they have a bigger spend with them. So the biggest concern that the carriers should have is how can they jack up that short-term markets to avoid massive losses on those long-term contracts that will be forced upon them.
Yeah, no, it's going to be an interesting time, and I think that this all goes back to the relationship between the carriers and the shippers. And this has always been a strained relationship, and it was an extremely strained relationship during the sort of the COVID boom with the very, very low service levels and the extremely jacked up pricing, and then we have the situation now where the tables have turned. So just to wrap things up, if we could talk about, where you see the relationship between shippers and carriers, how they feel towards each other, and how can this relationship ever be brought back together again?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I think the relationship in many ways is very transactional, right? And they treat each other differently depending on whether it's a buyer's market or a seller's market, right? And in one side of it, when it's a buyer's market, the customers has all the power, and vice versa when it's a seller's market, as we clearly saw, because the sellers can then offer a much weaker product at a much higher price. So it's very counterintuitive. Now, I've always been an advocate for sort of hoping that they can find a different way of dealing with each other. But I realized that it will only be possible if you find pricing mechanisms that take the short-term market movements into equation. Because the temptation for a shipping line to not pick up a cargo at a $2,000 contract when the spot market is at 10 is too big. And I can arguably understand that because for many, many, many periods of time and years, they've lost money. So whenever there's an opportunity to make a sizable amount of money, they need to seize it. And that means, from a buyer's point of view, that you need to find a mechanism that sort of regulates your price within a certain bandwidth so that you're never necessarily the lowest paying one, but your service is sort of regular and intact whenever the peaks or drops plays in, right? And that's challenging to have a belief as to whether they will make that work or not. But I believe there is more interest now in evaluating index mechanisms in the contracts than we've seen ever before. But whether they're able to make that leap remains to be seen.
Yeah, well, exciting times and a lot of changes both on the spot side and the long-term side. So, as always, Patrick, great to speak with you, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for inviting me, Greg. A pleasure as always.
All right, everybody, we are done with day number 1 of Global Supply Chain Week. Hopefully, you got a little bit of interesting information about the maritime space. You're just a little bit more knowledgeable with what you need to know to succeed.
That's right, and this has been an amazing networking opportunity, so hopefully you made a few friends out there. I know I have, so I have some LinkedIn messages to get back to. And if you have been watching on LinkedIn this entire time, thank you. We appreciate you. But you want to get the full experience, you have to go to live.freightwaves.com, get registered there, and then you'll be eligible for one of our giveaways. And Kaylee, we have a couple now.
Yeah, Anthony, we've got 2 giveaways to get through today. So our first one is for that Yeti Trailhead Camp Chair, something that I desperately wanted. They're pretty awesome. We're going to give a quick little drum roll and a congrats to Nick Pesci, who is the Senior Manager over at Oracle. Nick, congrats on that win there for our first prize. Hopefully you get out and enjoy enjoy your Yeti camp chair. It's like 80 degrees right now in Chattanooga. I would definitely be sitting outside in the sunshine in it.
So Kaylee, is this here? Are we in spring now? Are we?
No.
Okay, I'm sure.
It's like that fake out spring,
Okay.
you know?
Okay, I'm sure you'll give us an update next week on the weather.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
But let's announce our second winner. Who we got?
All right, so our next winner is going to be for the Apple HomePod Mini, and that's going to go to none other but Betty Stanberry, the Senior Trade Compliance Specialist over at Hampton Products International Corp. So, Betty, congratulations.
Awesome, you guys. Thank you both so much for sticking with us today. And if you want to be eligible to win prizes on our next 2 days of Global Supply Chain Week, all you have to do is head on over to live.freightwaves.com. Tell your friends, tell your family, hey, maybe they just want to learn a little bit more about supply chain while also being eligible to win. We're going to give away a big green egg. We're going to give away an awesome cooler bag from Hydro Flask. We're going to give away an Apple 4K TV as well by the time that we're done here this week. So you definitely don't want to miss out on those giveaways. Also, as Anthony mentioned, the networking opportunities are even more priceless than those giveaways. So get there, start to make some friends, and then when you come to Future Supply Chain in Cleveland, Ohio, and back here for the Future of Freight Festival in November, you'll know some people already.
Exactly. And Kaylee, I think you're spot on. I mean, it's funny because you can say, hey, invite your friends and family to watch, but tomorrow is going to have one of those days where it's something for everyone, even if you're not in the supply chain when we get into CPG.
Right. Just being the consumer means that you've got a lot to learn. So tune in tomorrow. We'll start live at 9 a.m. Before we leave for today, we've got to give a big shout out to our Universal event sponsor, Roadrunner. Thank you guys for the support. These events don't happen without the help of our sponsorship. So huge thank you to them. And Anthony, let's talk a little bit about our webinar coming up next week as well.
That's right. So we're going to have our very own founder and CEO, Craig Fuller, and Zach Strickland, of course, one of our very brightest here, head of Freight Market Intelligence, doing a State of Freight webinar, and that's going to be live here on FreightWaves Airways. You don't want to miss that. We had a previous one last month as well, and amazing feedback and amazing insights on that one as well.
Absolutely. So stay tuned for that. Also, we'll see you guys here tomorrow back live at 9, kicking off the day with a keynote speech from myself and HelloFresh. Tomorrow's retail, beverage, food, CPG. We'll see you then. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.
FreightWaves is the #1 source for transportation and logistics news. FreightWaves.com provides you with in-depth news coverage, data, and insights from the leading industry journalists and market experts. On FreightWaves.com, you can also watch the only streaming TV network dedicated to freight. FreightWaves TV provides you with coverage you won't find anywhere else. However you like your news delivered, check us out online or on the FreightWaves app.
The 2023 Freight Tech 25 list is filled with meaningful innovators from across the industry who are helping shape what the future of supply chain will look like. Check out the full list of these companies and all the latest Freight Tech news at FreightWaves.com.
Guests come to an event like F3, we know what they want is a chance to show off their products, their swag, and make new partnerships that will last until our next FreightWaves event.
But the problem is there are so many industry events, it can be so hard to find the right one to invest your time and energy in. We at FreightWaves take your investment seriously.
Which is why we've brought together thousands of industry professionals in one city over 3 days to showcase all you have to offer.
Because your successful connections at an event like F3 move all of us forward.
Don't believe us?
Join us in June.
The truck is now 3 days a week.
FreightWaves is the #1 source for transportation and logistics news. FreightWaves.com provides you with in-depth news coverage, data, and insights from the leading industry journalists and market experts. On FreightWaves.com, you can also watch the only streaming TV network dedicated to freight. FreightWaves TV provides you with coverage you won't find anywhere else. However you like your news delivered, check us out online or on the FreightWaves app.
Welcome back to another edition of Check Call. Check Call. Check Call. Check Call.
Let's go.
Nobody works for free, so why should we be expecting our drivers to? Okay, let's just get it together now. What are some of those proactive steps that you can start taking now? For myself, I would like the Earth to still be here for a little bit longer, but you know, is a hot dog a sandwich?
Oh, okay. Is pizza an open face sandwich? It's bread.
I have been ready for this question. I've seen the show.
We're all in this together.
Thanks for making me hungry. Now I want a hot dog.
You're welcome. Catch episodes of Check Call Tuesdays at 12:30 on FreightWaves TV. Keep up with all things Check Call on FreightWaves.com/checkcall. See you on the internet.
FreightWaves is the #1 source for transportation and logistics news. FreightWaves.com provides you with in-depth news coverage, data, and insights from the leading industry journalists and market experts. On FreightWaves.com, you can also watch the only streaming